A main story of the weekly parasha is the binding of Isaac. Akedah, Eked, La'akod is an archaic word for tying with ropes, binding with ropes. Usually, I'd rather not speak about this story. I find other stories to talk about. There are several other stories in the parasha. There's the story of the Haftarah, and there are many other matters that one should and can talk about. It's usually around the time when it's the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, also Isaac, Yitzhak, Rabin, Yitzhak. So usually I find reasons to talk about something else, but this year I started to try and face this complicated heritage, which is in the heart of our cultural of Judaism. And I want to be honest with you and say that it was hard for me to write it. I usually sermons come to me easily, and that one was a bit harsh. It took me a while. Doesn't mean it's better, just saying it took me a while. So just to be clear, I'm going to offer here a few directions and a few interpretations, but I'm not going to give any clear answers because I don't have any such clear answers. And so the story of the binding of Isaac appears in the book of Genesis, chapter 22. According to the commandment of the Eternal, Abraham is binding his son Isaac on the altar. He puts the woods in order to slaughter him and then to burn him as a sacrifice. And the last moment before he is slaughtering him, he's being called by the angel of God, says, "Don't do it to your son," and praising him for being fear of the Lord. And Abraham lifts up his eyes and he sees a ram getting complicated, getting ingewinkeld with the woods, and the poor ram is being sacrificed instead of his son. And that story considered in the Jewish tradition and in other traditions as well, to an exemplary, shining example of Mesirus Nefesh, of giving the heart, giving the soul, of devotion, of faith in God, and to the hardest of the 10 ordeals, the 10 trials that Abraham was taken by God and stood in. And the story of the binding of Isaac is not another biblical story. It's a formative story that have formed years, generations of Jewish consciousness, of total devotion to God, and the willingness to sacrifice without hesitation what is dearest to you, to all, that has been considered as the ultimate proof of the divine belief in God. God says, "Do not lay your hands on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you are fearing God, because you are not withheld from me your own son, your only son." So the questions related to God. Why does God needs this kind of ordeals, these kinds of trials? God's supposed to know what's going on in your heart. Why does he need to test you? And how can the moral God ask such an anti-moral request from the believers? That's about God. Now, question about Abraham. What kind of a father you are? One son he bands to the desert, another son he binds and tries to kill. When it came to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abram was fighting with God, right? Remember that? Maybe there would be 50 righteous people, maybe there would be 40 righteous people. God, may I speak? Maybe there will be only 30, maybe there will be only 20. When it comes to total strangers, other than Lot, but okay, when it comes to total strangers, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, who are evil people, you were like you were like fighting with God. When it comes to your own son, you just obey. Maybe God wanted him to refuse. Maybe doing what you were asked is failing the test. Maybe like he said, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat," is the judge of all the earth, will not do fair judgment, will not do justice. This is what he tell about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why did you say it here as well? The silence of Abraham is questionable. Forward. Why there is a need to test Abraham? God's supposed to know the future, so he knows that if you will ask Abraham, then Abraham will obey. So what's the logic here? Seriously, what's the logic here? So classic interpretation, Jewish interpretation, give two classical answers. One, trials are not for God, they are to give you an opportunity to reach a higher spiritual level. It says, I'm quoting one rabbi, "Lo ba hanisayon kedei lada'at, ela kedei la'ashbicho." The trial, the attempt, didn't come to know, but to benefit him, kedei sheyosif lehitztadek, so he'd be even further tzaddik. That even though it's in your power, it's in potential, until you're not actualizing it, how do you know you're going to do it? Until you're not actualizing it, it's in your power. Well, we have many things in our power that we don't do. You don't know how strong you are until you have to be strong, right? Everyone here can test on their life. You don't know how strong you are until you are pushed to the wall and you have to be strong. So until you have to take it from potential to actual, you don't know how you are. Okay. And the second thing is to give you reward, because God knows that you're going to stand to the moment, you're going to stand to the ordeal. Then Ibn Ezra, for example, the medieval commentator says, Hashem nisahu kedei sheyekabel sachar. The Almighty had tried him so he will be rewarded. What kind of example is this? What kind of an answer is this? All that so Abraham will have more reward for the war to come? Or this to come? I have no doubt that Abraham would rather not to be tried like that and would give us that reward, whatever that may be. It destroyed their family. Abraham and Sarah don't talk. They live in different places. Sarah lives in Beersheba. Abraham lives in Beersheba. Sarah lives in Hebron. There is no more dialogue between them. Isaac and Abraham, there's the dialogue between them as they go, and after that there's no more dialogue between them. It ruined the family. They're all in post-trauma now. Okay. That's traditional questions and answers. Now let's talk about the more general role that this story, this narrative had on the culture. So it was discussed in the cultural and philosophical and the hermeneutic discussions for years since then, because the dynamic is confusing. God brings the believer to a place which is unmoral. God pushes it. It's almost like abusing the believer. And then there's like a dichotomy message, because then God is being touched by the devotion. He said, okay, I will make you a blessing. I will make you a blessing. I will give you many, many children from this child that you almost killed. We said Abraham stood to the moment. Again, maybe he should have said, God, thank you up till here. You have taught me what are mercifulness. You have taught me just and righteousness. If you ask me that, I will tell you on behalf of what you taught me, no. And every year I read the commentary, old and new, and traditionalist and radical and straight and upside down. And believe me, I've done my reading. I'm not content. I'm not content. And every year again, when you reach that story, you're like, it cannot be that what God wants is blind believers. This kind of God is not the God I'm interested to believe in. Next. When it comes to the binding of Ishmael, the banning of Ishmael, the banning of Israel, because those stories following one of the other, we are reading it in Rosh Hashanah. The first day we're reading Ishmael, the second day we're reading Isaac. If you remember, not long ago, read it in Rosh Hashanah. Okay, there's several parallels between those stories. Okay, I've written to me point, but I don't want to go over it. Abraham is very quick to answer the request to get rid of his children. And in both sons, it ends with God blessing the children, with you will have a national prevalence. You will prevail as a nation, whether it's Ishmael and his nation, and Isaac and his nation. By the way, Ishmael has also 12 tribes, 12 chieftains. The Israelites have 12 tribes, 12 chieftains, and you will have possession of land, and you will be successful on the personal note. So there is like really the Bible goes out of its way to make the parallel between those two cases. And finally, how this story is formative in Western civilization. And there are many examples. In art, figurative art, in philosophy. And let me tell you something about philosophy. So there's a known case of the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. He writes in Fear and Trembling, his famous book, Fear and Trembling, about Abraham, the Knight of Fate. Knight, K-N-I-T, Knight of Fate. And he's doing a kind of existential. He's talking about the leap that that Abraham is doing, how he lives both in the existential mode, he lives in the highest levels, and in this level, how he manages to kind of bridge this gap between the unbearable, the unbearable and the realistic. So that is kind of known. This is less known is someone who continues that path, this existential move, and this is something I came across on my MA studies in cultural studies and hermeneutic. Those who heard about Jacques Derrida, a Jewish, Algerian, French philosopher, he died in 1995. And in his last book that was published after his death, a book that was published in 1999, it's called La Donnée la Mort, the gift of death. Donnée la Mort, the gift of death. One of the most intimate, special text. And he tried to approach this unbearable, what is unbearable to bear. The attempt and the sacrifice of the father, sacrifice of the son, and he goes via Kierkegaard, Kafka, Levinas, very, very tame. Derrida usually writes, he paints like a very wide text. Here he's like walking, he's almost minimalistic. Very interesting, very interesting. The paradox, in short, when you betray the ethical commandment because there is an internal imperative demand. Let me say it again. We all share ethical imperative, right? Like there's a ethical commandment which is shared to all. This is the base of Western civilization, right? You cannot do what you presume the other cannot do. You cannot do what you presume that you wouldn't think the other should do. Why I cannot throw litter in the street, dump in the street, because I think that if everyone would do it, it would be very bad. So I cannot do it because I presume the others can do it. So here there is like, you betray the general ethical commandment because there is an internal voice in you that says that this is what you actually should do. And that's what he elaborates. I cannot speak about it more now. You can look it up. Donnée la Mort, the gift of death by Jacques Derrida. Okay. In poetry, in literature, the binding of Isaac was used to raise questions about the mercifulness of God, because there's a clear gap between the image of God as merciful and gracious and the horrible things that we face in our world. And from the early days of history, this is a question that is dealt, the existence of evil, and the story of the binding is a strong metaphor to use in this regard. Because even in the end, God is like having pity on Isaac, and he's not stopping his father from killing him, but God is not merciful in other cases. Why God is merciful in some cases and not merciful in other cases? I don't know. We simply don't know. So what I'd like to end with is a poem about the binding of Isaac, and that's a poem that was representative to a whole generation. let me say, there are plenty of usage of Isaac and the binding of Isaac in Israeli poetry. I didn't want to bring them. I want to bring something from the general poetry. The generation who grew up into the horrifying events of World War I, to the schism, to the break, to the collapse it brought to the order of the world and to the ideologies or to the world of the 19th century that believed in progress and believed that human beings are good. We in the 21st century, we are rather broken to start with. We are very disillusioned about humanity to start with, but they were more optimistic generation and before World War I. And on 1920, the poet Wilfred Owen publishes a song as a response to World War I. He wrote several known songs that represent the generation of World War I. And the biblical background is used as the platform to critique on the acts, the procedures, the kings, what led to World War I, and it's called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young. I'm going to read it to you. Again, 1920, Wilfred Owen. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him and the knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparation, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride. This is offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. The last two lines. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. These last two lines are the only one that rhyme, and the image they paint is terrifying. The old man methodically killing the seed of Europe, and that's a main power of this image set out in the poem, culminating in these last two lines. This is what makes it haunting. And I'd like to leave it in this hauntiness, not to solve it with a nice story or give it a nice solution to conclude, because that is much more respectful to all those whose life were taken because parents bided their children on behalf of ideologies. And then there was no angel who came and said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. If we leave it with a question mark, we are leaving it in much more authentic space. Shabbat Shalom. Good. It was a harsh one for me.